So when we last left off, we had completed a really rough prototype of our level that we designed. And I mentioned at the end of the last video that I wanted to do a second pass on the prototype build for this level, just to add a little bit more visual interest, because right now it's quite flat, it's quite boring, and this would really benefit from, some more polish before we move on to the next section. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this second pass, as how you add visual interest to your level is largely up to you and your own design. But I do want to make sure I take the time out to do this, because although this course is not really about design theory or what makes for a good level design, I do want to highlight that game design is an iterative process. And what that means is that we don't just make our plan and build our level and then it's done. What we do is we make a rough sketch for a plan, we test it out in any way we can, and then we make changes based on the results of those tests. So we're constantly sort of looping through our development cycles. And this has been proven to be the more effective method for game design, and the results just tend to be a little bit better. So make sure you're constantly testing, you're constantly looping, and you're constantly iterating as you design your levels. So there are, as I said, it's really up to you how you want to add, variation to this. But when I just come in here and I press play, the first thing I notice in this first room is that I can just see straight into the second room, and there's just not a lot going on. So the first thing I want to do to add some variation is to vary the height of my rooms. So I'm gonna raise and lower some of these rooms and connect them with stairs, which again was not part of my original level design, but once I had it built in 3D and testing it out, it proved to be necessary. So don't be afraid to deviate a little bit from those level designs if it improves your level. So the way I'm gonna do this, let's pop out. I'm just, again, using the W, holding right click and WASD, and pulling myself out of this level. So this is what my level looks like from the outside. Not very interesting, but so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start raising and lowering these rooms. And I'm gonna start with this first room here, and I'm gonna raise it up by basically 4 meters, one wall unit, just so we keep everything maintained on the grid that we have created. We don't wanna be breaking the grid if it's not necessary. And the reason I'm gonna raise this first room is that if I lower the second one, well, then we have to lower everything after it so that we can still traverse the level. And I think it's easier to raise one room up than lower 4 rooms down. So let's go ahead and do that. This is gonna be pretty straightforward. I'm gonna open up my outliner and pin it open. And since we already have all of our pieces organized into these folders that we did in our first pass of our prototype, it's going to be really easy to just select everything. So all I did here, I came up to, there we go. I came up to the room 1, I expanded it. I selected everything by shift and clicking and selecting everything in this folder. So now I know I have everything in room 1 selected. So what I have to do now is I just have to make sure my grid snap is on, and I'm gonna keep it at a distance of 100. So then I'm gonna grab the gizmo and I'm gonna 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that has, if you look here, snapped up this entire room. It has moved it up by exactly the height of 1 wall unit. So now if we play, well, obviously we have some issues here because now we can just run out of the world, and that's not what we want. So we really only have to edit this hallway sort of transitional room here. So we're gonna keep things the way they are for the most part, but we're gonna delete this floor unit. And we need to connect this floor to this floor now. And the way that I'm gonna do that is by creating another prototype mesh here, and I'm gonna create some stairs. So let's try to get my camera in a better position here. And if you need to, do not be afraid to hide your ceilings. That's the whole point. The whole reason why we put the ceilings in a separate subfolder is so we could quickly toggle them on and off so we can see what we're doing here. Okay, I'm gonna collapse my outliner for the time being. And what I'm gonna do is come up to the mode selection, and I'm gonna go back into modeling mode. Again, this should all be reviewed. This is the same way we created all these walls and ceilings and floor pieces. But instead of creating a box right here, we're gonna come down here to where it says stairs. Now this is really handy. Excuse me, that Epic has included a stair primitive because it's such a common level design element. So if we click on the stairs and we drag it out here, you'll see the little preview just the same way that we had for our regular box meshes here. So I'm gonna change some of these initialization settings, and I mean, there's a lot of things going on here. For example, you can even have like a curved stair by changing the stairs type, a spiral. So depending on what the needs are for your level design, there's a lot of options for you here. I'm gonna keep it at linear, which is just a normal straight staircase. And I tested this out off camera a little bit, so this may require a little bit more trial and error for you if your design is not the same, if you're not following my design. So don't be afraid of having, to do some trial and error. I did that as well, just off camera. So I'm going to change my number of steps to 20, which gives me a longer staircase. I'm going to change the step width to 400, and that changes the width here. And again, I'm using 400 because that is 4 meters, which is the width of all my wall and floor pieces. So you can see when I put it here, it lines up perfectly with those grid lines once again. The step height, I'm going to leave at 20. And the step depth, I'm going to change from 30 to 20 as well. And that's just gonna make this fit within my 4 by 4 meter sort of grid outline that I have for all my other pieces. Now these stairs are quite steep, depending on your level design and your aesthetics, these might be too steep for you. Our character is going to have no problem going down them, as essentially the way that collision on stairs works is that basically the character sees this as a ramp and will treat it as such. But so the steepness may be an issue for you aesthetically, but it should be no problem functionally. So we're gonna have all these settings here. Just check all these other ones. Snap to grid we want on. And then if you like, you can set your material. I'm gonna set it to the same green that we have for our floors. I'm just sort of, again, these colors are not at all reflective of what the final level is going to look like. They're just sort of a way for me to color code the different types of meshes. So everything that is like a floor piece that our character can walk on, I have colored green. Everything that is a wall is red, and everything that is a ceiling is blue, at least for the time being. And again, of course, you can always do whatever colors you want. If you want them to be more reflective of your final colors, that's fine too. So the only reason I do this in these crazy colors is because sometimes I work in unlit mode. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about wireframe, but there's all of our shading models right here. If you click on this icon where it says lit, which will show you your game, your level with the lighting as it will appear, in your final game. But, for whatever reason, you might be working in some darker rooms like this. You may want to be able to see a little bit better. You can come down here to lit and change it to unlit, and that will give you flat colors. And you can see already when I put the stairs and the floor pieces next to each other, it can be sort of hard to distinguish when everything is the same color, which pieces are which. So you can imagine that if like all of these walls and these ceilings were green, well, we wouldn't really be able to see where the floor ends and where the walls begin. So that's why I have color coded it in such a way. Okay, anyway, moving on. So we have our stairs, we have the correct numbers in here. I'm just gonna click to place it. I'm gonna hit, oops, not that. I'm gonna hit complete. All right, so we can go back to lit mode also. So let's open up our content drawer. We see our stairs have been created here next to all of our other pieces that we've generated in our mesh gen folder. I'm just gonna select it. I'm gonna press F2 and I'm gonna delete the random string. So it's just stairs. And in fact, in order to stay with this sort of convention I have of putting the size of the piece with the name of the piece, I'm gonna hit F2 one more time. Press underscore 4 meters. Because again, this is a 4 meter wide by 4 meter long staircase and it raises up 4 meters. So I'm gonna press E and I do have snapping turned on in 10-degree increments here. Let's just rotate it 90 degrees so it's facing the right way. Let's press W to get our move gizmo back and let's slide it here. So if we hit play now, you'll see that we can now move downwards and get into this room. Now, of course, we have all these gaps here that we need to fill. Before we do that though, let's put our stairs. I'm gonna open the outliner. I'm gonna right click on these stairs we just created. I'm just gonna move them to the folder for room 1, just so we don't get messy. Okay, I'm gonna come out of modeling mode for the time being, just to sort of get rid of this side panel and give me a little bit more screen area to work with. So all I have to do to fill up these holes, again, is to select these walls that were part of room 1 originally. I'm gonna hold Alt, and I'm gonna drag down to duplicate. Again, with snapping turned on, this should be really quick. Okay. So I'm gonna now come into the outliner, and I'm gonna unhide ceiling 2, and you can tell it's hidden because we have all these little closed eye icons. Now when you play your game, regardless of what's hidden, the hiding things in the outliner only hides them temporarily. So when you press play, all these things are still there. It will not hide them from your game. You know, in order to do that, you would either have to delete them from your level entirely, or there's, for most actor types, there's sort of a in the details panel. If you pull this out and we search hidden, there is a hidden in game checkbox here. So if I were to press this and now press play, now we are not seeing that piece in the game anymore. It is still there as far as the editor is concerned, but functionally it's not there in game. So you can see I can walk over it, but it's just not visible anymore. Let me undo that change. There we go. We want it to be visible in game. So let's go back and glimpse that unhide ceiling 2 so we can see what we're working with. And this is a case where I might go into unlit mode just to get a better view of what I'm doing here. Now, it's pretty tempting, I would say, to just duplicate out this wall and turn it around 90 and say, you know, okay, all my gaps are blocked. I'm done here. But this is kind of what I'm talking about with iterative design and the importance of playtesting, because if we hit play now, well, it's true, we can get through it, but it's a little strange looking, and it's probably easier to see if I put a light right here. So you can see when I drag the light out here, there's no effect because I'm in unlit mode. So just change back to lit mode to see the results. So again, it's just sort of abrupt here, this change, and the clearance isn't great. Now, if this is what you want, that's totally fine for your design. I'm gonna sort of dormer this out a little bit though, so it's a little less severe of a drop, because when we're running up to it, it does look like just sort of a pit we would fall into, not a staircase. So I'm going to delete that. And I think what I'm going to do is raise this one up by just 2 meters. So I'm actually going to change my snapping size back to 100. And I'm going to hold Control and press End to snap it back to the correct height, which means that it's exactly on one of those 100 grid lines. I do have to shift it over just by a little bit because of the way I built this level. So basically I'm going to have this transition from these two rooms on the ceiling portion be a little bit more gradual, and it's going to match the floor transition a little bit better. So now I have this here. What I'm going to do is duplicate this out and make sure it's lined up. And I'm going to duplicate this up so it's sitting on this one. And I'm going to rotate it around. Again, just holding Alt for all of these. Nothing too crazy. Okay. So now I have more of a stepping effect down into the roof here. And I'm getting a little bit of light leaking, so I'm just going to move that forward. And, oh, actually light leaking is caused by that. And that lines up with the grid nicely as well. Okay, so we have a little bit more of a stepping effect down. Let's press play, and let's test out how this feels. That feels a lot better to me. It feels like more of a natural room transition. Now, you may be wondering about like these pieces that are sticking up outside. If you cared to, or you needed to for some reason, you could make a wall piece that was 4 meters by 2 meters this way, the same way we've made these pieces, and have a separate memory reference right here. However, because of the design of this level, we're never going to see the outside of it in game. So it is totally fine in that instance to have things sort of sticking out the sides at, you know, at funny angles and funny intersections. If it's never going to be seen, there's no reason really to spend a lot of time making the outside pretty. That being said, it's largely dependent on the textures that you use in this case. So if I were to have a texture on this piece, I'm getting distracted by trying to line up things. If I were to have a texture on these wall pieces, and for whatever reason, the nature of the texture made it look strange if it was cut off halfway, well, in that case, you might want to have a separate 2x4 wall piece there, you know, and have it, and it would have its own texture that would, you know, sort of tile nicely with the other pieces. But again, we'll get more into that sort of stuff when we get into the like creating art asset segment of the course. But for now, this is totally sufficient. So the other thing that you'll see is happening here is I have everything lined up really nicely on the grid, but I'm getting this Z fighting. And again, Z fighting is caused by when you have two pieces of mesh that are trying to occupy the same physical space, which we know in the real world is impossible. And in virtual space, it's possible to do this, but the computer and Unreal Engine will not know which face to render as being on top. So you'll get this flickering. Now, I mean, you can spend a lot of time aligning this in different ways, but actually what I'm going to do to solve this for the time being is I'm just going to hide it away. And this is something that game designers and level builders do all the time. So we're going to start adding columns in. One, to hide these seams, these flickering Z fighting areas, and also just to break up these walls a little bit visually. So you have to imagine that when we have this level finished out with our art assets, we're going to have some sort of like probably tiling brick or stone texture. And when you just have like sort of an endless swath of that across a large space, one, you may notice that it's a repeating texture. When you have a lot of repetition next to each other, without anything to break it up, the eye tends to notice more that it is a tiling texture. And again, too, just to hide that stuff away. And it will also break up sort of the silhouette of it. So instead of just having a boring, flat, plain wall, we'll have some columns and stuff that will stick out a little bit and sort of break it up with these big chunks. So we need to make a new column piece because we don't have a column piece to use right here. So we're gonna do this the same way we've done everything. There's no surprises here. We're gonna go into modeling mode. I'm gonna select a box. And again, I tested this out a little bit before, so I know I want this to be 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters by 400 centimeters. And again, I'm choosing 400 because that is the height of my walls. And so I don't want to use that green because again, we're getting a little, it's getting a little unclear here. I'm actually going to make a brand new material for columns here so that we can visually, at a glance, sort of see them as contrasted from the walls. So I'm going to just hit this reset arrow right here and set it back to this default sort of gray block material, which is Unreal Engine's default for when you do not have a material assigned. Okay, so I'm just going to place this one right here, and I'm going to press complete. I'm going to open up my content drawer and select it in the browser, hit F2, and I'm going to call it column underscore 4 meters. Okay, so now I just want to assign a new material to this. So we're going to go into our template. I believe it's level prototyping materials. This is just where all our grid materials were. I'm going to select, say, the green one. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to press Control and D to duplicate it. You can also do this by right-clicking and selecting duplicate. And we're going to make this one purple. So I'm going to double-click to open up this material instance. And under here where it says surface color, click and select whatever material color you want. That looks fine to me. We're going to hit save up in the top left and we can close it out from here. So now we just need to assign that material as the default for the column so that every time we pull the column out from the content browser, it will already have that material assigned to it and we do not have to do it manually. So I'm just going to select it in the level. I'm going to hold Control and press B. That's going to pull up the location of this mesh in the content browser. Let's double click it. And right here under material slots, we're going to click the drop down and search purple. Should be the only one. And there you go. Hit save, close it out. So last thing we need to do before we just start rolling with this is to put it in our folder. It's called box 26 at the moment because I dropped it into the world from the mesh generator before we renamed it. So you can either rename it in the outliner and duplicate it from there, or you could delete it and pull it out again from your content browser, and it would be called column because that is the name we gave it. So I'm going to move it to room 1. And I just want to double check really quickly by collapsing all these folders. Okay, so we do have some point lights that are not assigned to folders. I'm going to select this one in the outliner and hit F on my keyboard to zoom to it so I know where it is. I can see that it's part of room 5. So these are the lights I placed at the end of the last video. And then I believe I also placed a couple off camera just because it was a little difficult to see in some areas. So I'm just, I just put that one in the wrong folder. Move to room 3. And the last one was the one I just placed here to visualize this ceiling area. So I'm just going to move it to room 1. Okay, let's go back to lit mode. Sometimes when I'm in unlit mode, even with the grid, it can be hard to see depth. So I'm gonna go back into lit mode. I'm just gonna start placing these kind of just generally where I think they would go. Again, I'm using these to hide my seams and my Z-fighting here, but I'm also using it just to break up some of the sort of repetition in this room. So where I'm placing this is not necessarily going to line up with the grid every time. I'm just placing it where I think it works best visually. I mean, I am still using grid snapping, but as far as like aligning these lines perfectly, I'm less concerned about that with these columns. Just gonna move my light around so I can see what I'm doing a little bit. I like to put them in the corners, especially outer corners, because you can kind of see if we look at this one here, sometimes with these outer corners, when you have them made of 2 separate pieces, you get these really, really sharp angles that kind of break realism. So there, you know, you can either hide that away with columns, or you could make a separate corner piece with sort of a beveled edge here to make it smoother. Again, it's totally personal preference at that point. I like to hide them with columns. We probably just need more or better lights in this, but again, this is not even remotely going to look like our final lighting setup. This is just so I can see what I'm doing. So if it doesn't take you, if it's not taking you a lot of time to just like move the light over a little bit, you know, there's no harm in that. Now, if you're spending a lot of time moving your lights around to see, then, you know, it's probably worth just putting in a few more. So, speaking of lighting, I'm having a hard time seeing all my corners as I'm building. So I'm going to open the details panel on this light here, this point light that I have selected. And where it says attenuation radius 1000, this is basically how far does this light extend. So if I wanted to extend it out farther into the corners, I could just take this and drag on this value to slide it up. And you can see when I do this, the sort of the radius here will expand and contract, and also these corners are a little bit better lit. You don't want to have too many lights in your scene, especially if their attenuation radiuses are overlapping, because you'll get major performance drops. So if you're noticing that, you know, it's very framey and laggy even in the editor, check your lighting setups and make sure that you don't have too many of them, because calculating all those light bounces and stuff, it's very taxing on your machine. My machine's already making a lot of noise just doing this. Okay, so same thing here. I'm gonna start adding some columns to hide this stuff away, popping in and out of lit and unlit mode as needed. And now these ones are more into room 2 than they were into room 1, so I'm gonna select these and just move them over. Again, you can always duplicate with multiple pieces selected, that's no problem. And then same as I did for the walls, instead of making a 2-meter column, because we're never going to see the outside and I don't anticipate there being any major conflicts, I'm just going to duplicate this up and it's going to stick through the top, but that's totally fine. We'll never see that. So align things here. I'm still getting some Z fading, so I'm just going to pop this over until it's aligned. Something like that. It just dropped my snap distance down to 1 to get this better in place. And then for certain areas, you may notice that just the size of the pieces that you've made aren't really working. In this case, you would need to either make a column of a different size, or this is like a little hacky, but if the difference is quite small, you can scale it. So let's click on the scale tool here, and I'm just gonna change my snapping increment down, and I'm gonna snap it in so it fits nicely between these. Now, a word of caution when scaling pieces. Right now, it's not very apparent why this would be an issue because we are using these sort of object aligned materials. But with normal art assets, you don't want to scale them dramatically in the level because you'll stretch your textures. So if I, had some like sort of stone texture on this and I scaled these dramatically, to fit the space, they would be either stretched or squashed, and it would be very apparent, especially if they were next to other pieces that were not scaled. But if it's only slightly, usually the eye won't pick it up when you're in game, but it really is sort of a case-by-case basis thing here. There's no real rule for how much scaling is too much. It's just sort of up to you as a designer and an artist. But I generally never scale things more than 1.2 their original scale. So the scale, the base scale is always going to be 1 for every mesh object. And if I were to like scale this out this way. Let me pin this open so you can see it. So we're scaling in the Y right here. So this is already over 1.2, just that amount of scaling. So I generally don't scale it over 1.2. If it needs to be scaled over 1.2, I typically will just make a new mesh piece for it to avoid stretching. But again, that's all more on the art side, and this is the prototyping section, but I don't want to set you up with a bad prototype so that, when you go into the art creation section, you have to redo a bunch of stuff. That would not be good. I think I'm gonna split the difference here and have it sort of at the halfway point on this pit and pull it down. So I'm gonna pop back into lit mode here. I'm gonna bring this over so we can see a little bit better. You can also change the intensity of your lights if they're not strong enough. Again, in the details panel for the light when it's selected, the intensity is 8 candelas by default. You can type in a number manually, or you can put your cursor over these bars and slide it up. Obviously that's very blown out, but. So the next thing I wanted to address here as we move forward is this sort of bottomless pit. I'm gonna right click and press play from here. So at this point, this bottomless pit, while it is technically bottomless, because if we fall into it, our character will just fall out of the world forever, we don't necessarily want to see this sky underneath it. So, we want it to be sort of falling into a dark space. So the first thing I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to grab these wall pieces and make sure my snapping is correct. And I'm just going to duplicate them down a few times so we have more depth here. Okay, so I've just duplicated them down once. So let's right click and press play from here and look down. That's pretty good. So if we were, you know, playing this, unless we really were intentionally looking down, you know, we don't really see the edge. If we jump, we do kind of see it. So let's go one more. I'm just gonna select everything, all these bottom pieces. Press W and Alt, and I lost my gizmo, but no worries, the duplicates are still there. I just need to move them into the correct place. Okay, so one more time, play from here. That's pretty good. We probably won't be looking like this in the game, and in fact, if you know this were a real game, you would probably want to limit your camera angles so you can't, you know, do things like that. So the last thing I want to do for this pit here is I actually am going to put a bottom to it. Despite this being called a bottomless pit, you know, we're getting a lot of light coming in from the exterior of the level because we have the sky and the sun and everything out there. And I just don't want this bottom to be bright. So I'm going to go into unlit mode for just a moment. You can see we lose our sky when we're in unlit because that is part of our lighting setup. I'm going to grab this lure 4-meter piece and I'm going to drag it in here. And I'm going to place it at the bottom of my pit. But the issue with it as it is, I'll show you once I get this duplicated, is now if we come in, we right click, we play from here. Well, now we can see the bottom very clearly, so this is very much not a bottomless pit. So this has to do with the lighting system in Unreal and how everything just is lit the way it should be according to like realistic lighting bounces. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these black so you don't notice them quite as much. So I'm going to come into my prototyping materials. Just going to duplicate the green by clicking it and pressing Control and D. And I'm going to make a black grid. And you can even go so far as to get rid of these grid lines by making them all black, but this is fine for the time being. So now if I were to come into my mesh piece here and change it to my black material grid and saved it, well, that's going to change every piece in the level to this black, which is not what we want. So remember that changing the material from the static mesh editor, which is what you open when you double click on a static mesh asset, will change the default, which means that everything in the level will change, which is not what we want. So we're gonna come back into our static mesh editor and put this back to our green. But we don't have to, you know, not every instance of this static mesh needs to use its default. That's why we have it as default and non-default. So what we're going to do is just select the pieces in the level that we want to change. We're going to open the details here. And under materials here, we're going to type in black, prototype grid black. So it's going to change these pieces, and you'll see that now these pieces in the pit are changed and these ones remain green. Only the ones we selected are going to be changed to the black material. Okay, let's play from here again. So now when we come to this edge of this pit, well, it does have a bottom, but when we look down it without falling into it, we can't really see the bottom because of the way it's lit. And you could even maybe extend the walls down one more before the floor. That would be fine if you really wanted to give it sort of that bottomless pit feeling. But this is already much, much better. Okay. So we're at about 40 minutes. So I'm going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we're going to continue with the sort of second pass of our level prototype here.